Hello, thank you everybody for attending. So today I'm going to be talking about the science of autism. Now, this is not going to be a comprehensive everything we know about autism. It's some things that in my research I found interesting. There's a lot more out there. I could do, 5 or 6 of these talks about what we've learned, but I won't do that right now. Before we get into the topic, I want to say that we do have a neurodiversity ERG. It is pretty new. If you're interested in joining it, we will have a meeting in May, right, Sarah? I think we have one in May. Okay, so I will put my email in the chat, and if you're interested in attending, you can send me an email and I can add you to the invite list. So if anyone is interested in joining or even just checking out the neurodiversity ERG. So autism. Autism spectrum disorder, this is a quote, is a heterogeneous neurodevelopment disorder characterized by persistent deficits in social communications and interactions and the presence of restricted repetitive behaviors, interests, and activities. Or activities. So this is from the DSM official definition. Heterogeneous meaning it varies a lot person to person. So you will see as we go through some of this information that it does vary a lot. Some statistics. 1 in 40 children have been identified with autism spectrum disorder. It's 4 times more likely to be diagnosed in boys than girls. We're going to talk about that some. 80% of autistic women aren't diagnosed by the age of 18. Studies show it may be more common in girls than in boys even, but there's also some data showing that women or females have this protective effect that we'll talk about. 40% of autistic children are nonverbal. This may be an overestimation because it is so underdiagnosed in girls that it may only be 10% of autistic children are nonverbal or even less. It's just, underdiagnosed. Less than 40% of autistic students graduate college. Autistic individuals are 28 times more likely to commit suicide. And autism is estimated to be 40 to 80% heritable, meaning based on genetic mutations that might be inherited. Some of the characteristics of autism is an overactive nervous system. Parts of the brain get overstimulated and tend to get stuck and have repetitive thoughts. Fixations are special interest, as we like to call them. It's hard to switch focus. Sensory processing problems, easily overwhelmed, and autistic people tend to have a more restricted diet. And we'll talk about why a lot of those characteristics are as we go through some of this information. So the main things I'm going to talk about science-wise are genetics. So, mutations associated, synaptic pruning, which is very interesting, the female protective effect, brain imaging, and the gut microbiome. So we'll start with factors that are associated or go into autism. So there is a genetic factor. Like I said, 40 to 80% can be explained or do have a genetic factor. Oxidative stress, environmental factors, and immune dysfunction. These 3, particularly in the mother when she's pregnant, have been shown to increase risk of autism. And then characteristics of autism are language impairment, impaired social behaviors, cognitive dysfunction, and behavior and learning deficits. So to understand autism and to understand a lot of the science we're going to talk about, we need to understand sort of how the brain works. So the brain is made up of millions of neurons. These neurons are cells in the brain. And every time you learn something new or develop a new skill, these neurons make connections with each other. And this allows the neurons to communicate with each other. These connections are called a synapse. So where one neuron meets up with another neuron is a synapse. Neurons talk to each other through neurotransmitters. And most of you have probably heard of neurotransmitters. Serotonin being one a lot of people are familiar with because it is associated with depression. So synapses are extremely important. This is how basically everything in our brain works, is through these synapses. It has been found that the majority of mutations that are associated with autism are found in the synapses. So these are just some of the various proteins that have found to be mutated in people with autism. So the synapses are really important and seem to play a really big role, which makes sense because that's how the brain, the cells communicate with each other. And if there are mutations in the synapses, then it would make sense that that communication doesn't happen the way it's supposed to. Now, an interesting thing about these synapses, when, in the first 2 years of your life, you're making a lot of these connections between neurons. You're making a lot of these synapses. When you get to be around 2 years old, from the ages about 2 to 4, your body will start pruning or getting rid of some of these synapses. So basically, connections you don't need anymore, things that, you needed as a baby, but you're not going to need as you become a child, will be pruned. And that makes room for new connections. So, between 2 and 4, there's big advances in language development. And that is why we lose neuroplasticity, because pruning doesn't really occur much past puberty. It occurs a little bit, but not much. So yeah, between the ages of 2 and 4, a lot of language development, a lot of social development. So we prune these old neurons, the baby neurons, basically, so that we can make the kid synapses. And then again, at puberty, there's a big pruning where you could kind of think of it as the kid synapses get deleted. So we have room for adult synapses. So 2 to 4 and then puberty, really big, important times for synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning is really important for developing new knowledge and skills. So this gives sort of an example of synaptic pruning. So before pruning, you have all these connections. After pruning, you have a lot less connections so that new neurons can come in and make connections so that you can learn new skills. What they have found is that people who are autistic do not do synaptic pruning. They either don't do it at all or they don't do it nearly to the extent of neurotypical people. So autistic people tend to hold on to all of their synapses. And you can see that here. This is synapse density. So the neurotypical, you can see a lot of synapses early in life, and the number of synapses is decreasing. Autistic, there's still some decrease, not in everybody, but, it's not nearly as much decrease. What does this mean? Okay, what this means is there is not as much space in the brain to make new synapses, and this causes delays. So this can cause delays in language acquisition, delays in social skills, can cause just, sort of autistic people having interests that are more interest of younger people. So maybe during adolescence, your autistic person is still interested in cartoons or playing with their toys while all of their friends are starting to date. They're not, kind of at the same developmental stage because they didn't get rid of those old synapses. They still have their, I want to play with my stuffies synapses, or I want to watch cartoon synapses, and they're not developing the way their peers are. So this kind of shows, our artistic brain, we still have these extra synapses. They, aren't necessarily synapses that are needed anymore. They've been pruned from the typical brain, but the autistic brain still has it. And it is across the spectrum, yes. The level of pruning can vary. So, those that are more severe probably have done less pruning, maybe no pruning. Those that are, lower needs maybe did more pruning. But for every autistic person across the spectrum, there is a lack of pruning. Yeah, and the pruning is regulated by age. There's different cells that are involved in it, and we're not really going to get into that because it gets complicated, but it is an age thing. Okay, so you can see the autistic brain not only has more connections, but the level of communication between the three main, like this main connection here, is not nearly as strong as it is in the neurotypical brain. What that means is that autistic people, their brains don't specialize as much as it's supposed to. So, these connections, maybe these are social interaction connections. And in the neurotypical brain, they're very strong connections. But in the autistic brain, they're there, but they're not that strong because energy is being spent also on these other synapses. So it can cause, delays in development and not developing as much due to the not having that specialization. Okay, so how this can manifest, we talked about developmental delays. It can also manifest as being easily overwhelmed. You have all these extra synapses, all this extra information in your brain, all these extra connections your brain can make. And so it's easier for your brain to get overwhelmed. It's easier for autistic people to burn out. That brain just has so many connections going on. It does make it so that a lot of times autistic people can see connections better than neurotypical people. You don't have that specialization, but you can see, every part of it and put all these connections together. Yeah, there's a lot going on at puberty, not just, it's hormones, it's pruning in the brain. There's so much going on. No, there really aren't medications for autism. We'll talk about some things that they found that can help with symptoms as we go along. Okay, so that's synaptic pruning and the role that it plays in autism. And it seems to be the major cause of the characteristics of autism, but they're really not sure what causes the difference in the pruning. Some of it is genetic. Some of it we'll talk about is associated with the gut microbiome. So there's a lot that goes into why the pruning isn't happening the way it's supposed to. All right, now the female protective effect. This is, I think, interesting. As I said, girls are a lot less likely to be diagnosed than boys. Part of that might be because the diagnostic criteria is based on how boys manifest, and girls show different characteristics. They manifest differently. So it may just be way underdiagnosed in girls, but they've also found that girls do have this female protective effect. So they found that for a girl to have autism, they need more genetic mutations and more environmental risk factors than boys. So we need more problems, I guess, more things going wrong to cause autism in girls. If we're looking at mutations, they need more mutations. And this may be related to the oxytocin receptor. So women, girls have more oxytocin than males. Oxytocin is a hormone that's related or associated with labor, breastfeeding, but also nurturing, and women in general, females have more of this hormone and more of the receptor. So in addition to being related to labor and breastfeeding and things like that, it enhances neuroplasticity and reduces neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation would be certain immune cells that they think attack the cells that do synaptic pruning. So there's certain cells that are responsible for doing the pruning, and it appears in autistic people, those cells are being attacked by the immune system and killed. So those cells can't do the pruning, and oxytocin reduces that. So females have a higher expression of the oxytocin receptor in areas of the brain related to social functioning compared to males. So it is found that females with autism do have a better time with social interaction than males. It's still difficult for females, but it is better, a little bit easier. And that could be due to these enhanced oxytocin receptor. And if we're using social functioning as the main criteria for diagnosing autism, then it makes sense that girls would be underdiagnosed because they do a little bit better with social interaction because of the higher amount of oxytocin receptors. They have found that in boys, IV administration of oxytocin decreases the challenges associated with autism. So there is direct evidence that oxytocin can, decrease some of those challenges. Yep, that is not surprising. Okay, so that's the female protective effect. There's a lot more research going on with this, with oxytocin, its association with autism, whether, oxytocin could be a good treatment or not, maybe help with some of the challenges that autistic people can face. An area that autistic people really struggle with is executive functioning. So if you are autistic, you know this. Executive functioning is very difficult. These are the skills that you need basically to get things done. So planning, organization, task initiation, very difficult for a lot of people with autism. Flexibility, attention, self-control, working memory, time management, all these things you need to succeed, to get things done. They've done brain scans on people looking at the areas of the brain related to executive functioning, and they've compared autistic and non-autistic individuals. So we have the parts of the brain that are activated in yellow for the autistic individuals, parts of the brain in red activated for non-autistic. So you can see when they are trying to accomplish a task and need executive functioning, different parts of the brain are being used for autistic versus non-autistic. And in particular, this area of the brain is really important for activating executive functioning. And you can see it's activated in our non-autistic individuals, but not nearly as much as in our autistic individuals. Autistic individuals are activating other parts of the brain that aren't nearly as effective for executive functioning, which I find interesting. I like knowing that different parts of the brain are actually activated. It's not that the autistic person isn't trying hard enough or isn't organized enough or whatever you hear if you're autistic and people get on your case about not being able to do things. You're actually using different parts of your brain that aren't as effective for executive function. And then another interesting thing that was found is that in autistic children, so our young adults, younger than 25, they don't light up any of the executive functioning areas of the brain. So those younger than 25 are really, really going to struggle with anything related to executive function. They're just not lighting up. They're not doing it. In autistic individuals over 25, there is a part of the brain that is being used for executive functioning, but you can see it's a very different part than what the non-autistic people are using. So yeah, it's very interesting. So if you have an autistic child and they're struggling with doing homework or cleaning their room or things like that that require executive functioning, they truly may not have the ability to do it. Their brain may honestly not connect. It may not engage in executive functioning. And you may need to be basically their external executive functioning for them. So you may need to sit them down, walk them through things, give more help than you think you need to give because it's just not happening at that age. And then, even as adults, those with autism have a lot of struggles with executive functioning. If you're familiar with autism, you've heard of autistic inertia. That would be this task initiation. Basically, if you're autistic, you get stuck. You might be stuck on an activity. You might be stuck staring at the wall, doing nothing, but you're stuck. So it's inertia. And, overcoming that autistic inertia can be extremely difficult, even for adults. And it's just kind of breaking out of where you are and switching gears, which also goes along with flexibility, which is something autistic people definitely struggle with. So I guess, have more patience with your kids if they're not doing their homework or cleaning their room or things like that. They literally may not have the ability to activate the right parts of the brain to get it done. Okay, this is another one I found really interesting. We have a reward pathway in our brain. When we do things that are good for us, it activates the reward pathway. It makes us feel good so that we'll keep doing those things. This is how drug addiction happens. Drugs activate that reward pathway, make you feel good, and you need more and more of the drug to get that same good feeling. And that's basically how addiction ends up happening. But we have this reward pathway for things that we should do more of. So maybe exercising activates your reward pathway, eating good food, social interaction, lots of things can activate your reward pathway. What they found looking at brain scans is that in autistic individuals, that reward pathway is not activated nearly as much from social situations, social interactions. So this is the part, it's called the mesolimbic system. And this is in our neurotypical and our autistic individuals. So if you look at all the autistic individuals, you see that this pathway is a lot less red. It's a lot less activated from social situations. So it's not just that autistic people can struggle with social situations, it's that they do not get the same reward, the same good feeling from social interactions that your neurotypical people get. So they don't find it as rewarding. And it might be because they struggle, but it also might be just that the reward pathway is not activated as much. And so, if your autistic child is not interested in socializing, it may be that they don't get the good feelings from socializing that other people get. All right. And a lot of these, brain images I'm showing, we don't really know necessarily what the outcome is. It's just, I think it's interesting to see that there are differences in the brain and what parts of the brain are activated. So this was a study where they had people think about different verbs, like imagine doing this thing. And so they did a lot more than just hug. Some of them were like run or talk or dance. There was lots of them. And you were supposed to picture yourself doing this activity. How would it make you feel? What would you be doing? All of that. And there's this part of the brain here that is activated by thinking about activities. And what you see is in the neurotypical person, it is activated. In the autistic person, it is not activated. And so your autistic person may have a harder time basically have a harder time visualizing doing something and how it would feel and what they would do. That I don't know, Dora. I was looking, more at actual what's going on in the body versus intervention strategies. I know that the commonly used intervention strategy is behavioral modification techniques. And I know that recently I've read some things that have said that that's very ineffective for autistic children and that it might cause more harm in the long run doing behavior modification. So, it's hard. There's a lot of debate about it. And I saw some recent studies that they looked at, a lot of people that had ABA used and found that it didn't make them, better in the long run. And a lot of people find it very harmful, exactly. But even if you look beyond the harmfulness, it doesn't appear that it's helpful in autistic individuals. There is obviously a lot of debate about ABA. A lot of it comes down to you're focusing on behaviors instead of the child. A lot of it can be that you're making the child feel that everything they do is wrong. So, definitely you can't force a brain to activate if it's not going to activate. The synaptic pruning is not going to happen. If those connections aren't going to get made, there's nothing you can really do to make that happen. My personal opinion is that we should be, and I know it's pie in the sky, but as an autistic person, this is what I would like to see. I think we should focus more on accommodations for autistic children and adults and less on fixing the kid. So looking at what's in the IEP and seeing, is it realistic? for this child. It might not be realistic. Maybe they can't do it. And by trying to force them to do something they can't do, you're, just increasingly making them feel like a failure. Yeah, Deanna, there are, but is that increase in neuroplasticity in the elderly, is that helping them do pruning? And is that something that autistic children, some of them can't do? Maybe, yes, there are interventions that can help with the neuroplasticity, but maybe not as much as, in neurotypical people. Right. And that's very true. The more we learn about the brain, the more we can come up with stuff. Yeah. Yes, Beth, that's a big one. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 50, and it explained so much about my life, so much about how I felt about myself, how people treated me. I mean, it just, changed my life completely, finding out that I was autistic. And yes, Dora, so much variation. Exactly. And that's another thing, is that you have to focus on the child if we're talking about children, because every autistic person is different, and what works for one may not work for another. Yeah, definitely, Beth. I mean, I'm not going to get into all my emotional issues, but yeah, trying to fit into society, trying to, blaming yourself for all the ways you don't fit in when you don't know that something is different about you, So yeah, a lot of emotional issues to deal with related to all of that. Okay, this was another just sort of interesting study, more brain imaging. This was looking at neurotypical and autistic adults, or adolescents in this case. Yes, it is hard to get people to understand that autism is different for everybody. Everyone has their own kind of form of autism, I guess. So what they did was they showed pictures of people's faces with different emotions. So they showed an angry face and a sad face and a happy face, that type of thing. And they looked at what parts of the brain were activated. So when viewing emotions, autistic people activate much more of their brain than neurotypical people. So viewing these emotions, a lot more going on in the autistic brain. When they then had to match the emotion on the face to the actual emotion, so when you looked at the angry face and had to say that's an angry face, what they found was that a lot more of the neurotypical brain was activated compared to an autistic brain. What this, really means, I don't know, but it's interesting to think about that when viewing emotions on faces, autistic people are much more involved, much more activated. But when matching that face to the actual emotion, the neurotypical brain becomes much more activated. And so it may be that the autistic person sees these differences on the expression, they know, okay, your emotion has changed, but might have a hard time pinpointing what that emotion is, if that makes sense. So the more in touch with the change of the emotion, but not as capable of naming the emotion. And then this figure is really just sort of an overview of all the various studies and neuron densities and things, where the red are areas of the brain that are active in autistic children, or where there's a higher density of neurons, and the blue is for neurotypical. So you can just see totally different parts of the brain are activated. That's kind of what it all comes down to. Autistic people are using different parts of their brain than neurotypical people, for good or for bad, probably some of both, but we're using different parts of our brains. One thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about the synaptic pruning, because autistic people keep so many of their synapses, autistic people have bigger brains. That's something that's been very proven by science, is that the brain in an autistic person is bigger. Doesn't mean, that's not any comment on intelligence or anything like that. Just more synapses, more neurons, bigger brain. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about the gut microbiome and the role that it might play, because there's a lot of data coming out on this, and it's very interesting. This is a basic figure of the association between our microbiome and our brain. So the microbiome, we have a lot of microbes in our gut. So bacteria, protists, yeast, all sorts of little critters live in our gut. And there are some that are good for us and some that are not as good for us. All of them make chemicals. They can make these short chain fatty acids. They can make neurotransmitters. They can make toxins, depending on what the microbe is. These all can travel to the brain and impact synapses, as well as other cells in the brain. So there's a very big connection between the gut microbiome and the brain. So some of what they found as far as the gut microbiome with autistic people. Autistic people have increased intestinal permeability. We'll talk about what that means in a few minutes, but basically it means that any chemicals and things like that that are made in the gut, it's easier for them to get to the brain. The intestine is not as tightly sealed, basically. There's a decrease in lactobacillus, which is a bacteria related to basically keeping the intestines, making a good barrier so there isn't that permeability. So it makes sense. You don't have as many of those bacteria. So your intestinal lining is more permeable. There's also a decrease in bifidobacterium, which is considered a beneficial bacteria. There is an increase in the production of cytokines. Cytokines are immune chemicals that cause inflammation. So it can cause inflammation in the gut. That increases the permeability. Those cytokines can also travel to the brain and cause that inflammation I talked about in the brain, where those cells that do synaptic pruning end up getting killed by the immune system. So this increase in cytokines can be very damaging. Candida is a yeast. We all have Candida. Generally, it's kept under control by our gut microbiome. They found in autistic people that there is more Candida, more yeast in the gut. It produces ammonia and toxins. These can travel to the brain and cause damage. It also can cause malabsorption of minerals and carbohydrates, and that can increase autistic characteristics. So this, overgrowth of yeast may be causing some of the problems. People with autism also tend to have more Clostridium, and Clostridium can be very harmful in the gut. And they've done a lot of studies with autistic people, changing their diet, giving them probiotics, giving them prebiotics, doing fecal transplants. And they found all of these things that improve gut health do improve symptoms of autism. So there might be ways, to improve gut health, and that can improve some of those characteristics, some of those struggles. Now, this can be difficult because one of the characteristics of autism is a restricted diet. Autistic people tend to be a lot more restrictive in what they're willing to eat. And so it can be hard to change the diet to, have a healthier gut microbiome. And that's definitely something that's being looked into. One interesting thing I read, I didn't make a slide about it. Yep. I'm one of those that I'll eat the same thing every day for months, and then I totally burn out on it and I'll never eat it again for the rest of my life, which, some autistic people are like that. Some of them can eat the same thing every day for years and years and have no problem with it. So there's some interesting things with this restrictive diet. One thing they found is that in general, autistic people have a lot more taste buds than neurotypical people. So foods have a lot stronger taste to those with autism. That could explain some of, that restrictive eating. If everything tastes stronger, particularly bitter foods. People with autism, like babies, maybe that has to do with synaptic pruning. Maybe they're related. Bitter foods in particular are very bitter to autistic people. Most autistic people do not like coffee. They don't like dark chocolate. Anything that's bitter, they're not going to like. So that's interesting. A lot of vegetables tend to have a bitter taste. That's why a lot of autistic people do struggle with vegetables. A lot of autistic people find fruit to be too sweet. I'm one of those. I don't like most fruits too sweet because, again, more taste buds. So it's an interesting thing. And I saw something like a meme that I really liked. I should have put it in here. It was showing like a blueberry. Oh, yeah, smells. All of the senses are stronger in autistic people. That probably has to do with having so many synapses. You interpret those sensations more. So smells are going to be stronger, tastes are going to be bigger, things like that. So yeah, this thing I saw that I wish now that I had taken a picture or put in here, it showed like a blueberry. So it showed a blueberry and it was like sweet. And then next to it, it showed a blueberry and it was like tart. Next to it showed a blueberry and it said squishy. So, blueberries, any produce can vary a lot. And then it showed like a cracker and it said, tastes the same every time. And that's one reason that a lot of autistic people are not so big into eating produce, fruits and vegetables, because you never know what you're going to get. Maybe it's going to be squishy this time, or maybe it's going to be bitter this time. I don't know, so I'm going to stick with the safe food that is the same every time. Textures are huge for autistic people. There are foods I can't eat just because of the texture. Beans and nuts, can't do it. The texture of beans and nuts just really does not work for me. And so, texture can vary. And autistic people aren't going to have the same texture problems. Like mashed potatoes, fine with me, but I don't like the dry crumbliness of nuts and beans. And that, yes, Stephanie, that's a great point, that maybe the kid used to love this particular fruit, but they got one that had a funky texture one time and they're like, nope, if it can taste like that, I'm never going to eat it again. So just some of those things to keep in mind with the eating and problems, with this restrictive diet. But that also can cause problems with the gut microbiome. So if you can find ways to get some probiotics into the diet in a way that they'll tolerate, or, prebiotics, some of these things, it might help some with some of those areas that they're struggling. An interesting thing they found is that, and I point that it set it up here, right? Malabsorption of carbohydrates. They have found that autistic people have a hard time digesting carbohydrates, which is very interesting. Carbohydrates are our main energy source. We use glucose to make energy because a lot of autistic people have trouble absorbing and digesting carbohydrates. They're not making that energy from carbohydrates. And those carbohydrates can actually cause some toxins and things to build up if you're not digesting them quickly. So, right. So maybe because autistic people tend to not have the good gut microbiome, they can't digest the carbohydrates. So it has been suggested to do a reduced carbohydrate diet for autistic individuals, but you might find that a lot of autistic people really crave carbohydrates, probably because they're not digesting them properly. So that becomes very difficult. Let me put this person who's craving carbs on a low carb diet. I couldn't give up carbs, I'll tell you, but maybe it would be good for me too. I don't know. But yes, it would make sense that you would crave carbs if you're not able to digest them properly and you're low on ATP, on energy, and things like that. Now, one thing they found in particular, a particular nutrient that is deficient, is zinc deficiency. So zinc is deficient in most people with autism. And chronic zinc deficiency can really impact your gut microbiome. We also need zinc to have a healthy immune response. That's why, if you're fighting off a cold, they tell you to take zinc. And many of the genes that have been associated with autism interact with zinc. In particular, we didn't talk about specific proteins, but the SHANK3 protein is a big one they find mutated in people with autism. It interacts with zinc, and it's the master regulator of synapses. So you can see how important this particular protein could be, as well as zinc, for proper functioning of the protein. So maybe zinc supplements can help make the gut microbiome healthier, which could help with some of the struggles that autistic people tend to have. And, maybe a zinc supplement is something you can get, a child to take. Right. So to kind of summarize some of this gut microbiome stuff. The microbiome, it's infected by diet, pathogens, inflammation. Here we see basically the autistic gut. It has the, bad microbes. It's leaky. So all of these things that are being made by these microbes can leak out. So things like cytokines, these short chain fatty acids, a lot of neurotransmitters are made. And all of these things have been shown to increase the likelihood of autism. And then when the brain, then changes, it ends up impacting the gut, and it becomes this cycle of gut impacts brain, brain impacts gut, and it goes on and on. And I didn't really get into the neurotransmitters, but there's some interesting stuff there. And then, actually, one thing I forgot to mention when I talked about synaptic pruning, the synapses that do tend to get pruned are the more inhibitory ones. So autistic people have more excitatory neurons than inhibitory. Part of why autistic people can be more hyperactive, they have a hyperactive brain, we've got more excitatory neurons. So this is kind of just the same type of figure. You've got the restrictive feeding, so low diversity food decreases microbiome diversity, which leads to the unhealthy microbiome, which leads to cytokines, altered neurotransmitters, gut permeability, exacerbates autism. So it just becomes this cycle. And then this figure is really just to show you how complicated it really gets. So I'm not going to go into all of this. This is just to show you that it can get very complicated, just the interaction between the gut and the brain. Right, that is pretty much all I had to talk about today. I've got a whole lot of references. So there's one reference slide, another reference slide. I see that Melissa has her hand up. Do you want to say something, Melissa?
I just had a question. So as someone who was diagnosed with ADHD later in life, and I do know also that as an ADHD individual, I also tend to have OCD tendencies and generalized anxiety disorder. So I'm wondering, for people with autism, are there some connections to other things such as are autistic people more susceptible to things like OCD or ADHD, or are they finding those connections between autism and other issues?
There can definitely be a lot of overlap. So, there is certainly a group of autistic people that are also ADHD or autistic people that are also OCD. I don't know if it's a higher percentage than the general population. So I'm not sure if more autistic people are ADHD than the general population. But certainly some people have both. That answer the question?
It does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there will be a recording. Melissa said she'll be putting it up on the Science Center's YouTube. Okay. And I can give the slides to Melissa, and she said she'll put them on announcement PG 411. See if there's other questions. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I could work on a part 2 for another time. Okay. Diagnosis. Yeah, there's a lot of, I'll look into that, Yanni, for the next part 2 about dyes, because I'm not sure. So to get a diagnosis, I would talk to, you can start with your general practitioner. You probably will have to see a psychiatrist to get a diagnosis. Okay, let me see. I'm looking at the comments. Okay, yeah, Julie, it makes sense that if we're impacting gut function, that it could impact autism. Maybe not a cause, but could certainly make symptoms, characteristics harder to deal with. Yeah, definitely lots of influencers in the mix. Thank you. I'm glad you found it informative. Thank you for coming. I gave my email at the beginning. I can give it again. You're always welcome to email me with any questions you may have. That too. Yep. Allergic reactions are going to complicate symptoms for sure. All right. So I would say we're pretty much out of time. I see your question, Grinch. Maybe you can email me. We can talk more about it since we are basically at the top of the hour. Have fun. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Hi, Christina. This is Anuja. Unfortunately, I'm not able to raise my hand. That feature is not working for me. But I have a question.
Okay.
I have a daughter who is diagnosed with autism, and she's just turned 13. So we have probably tried everything under the sun that is available. We have tried mud therapy. We have sent her to ABA and dietary restrictions. The thing that I would like to understand, and if you can help, are there any kind of clinical studies or there any kind of treatment options that are ongoing or the research are ongoing? And if yes, is there any kind of possibility for this to be treated in coming years or something like that?
So, I mean, there's a lot of studies going on, definitely on different, treatments, diets, all sorts of things. Part of the problem is because there's so much variability between autistic individuals, there isn't a magic bullet. There isn't a magic pill, So what works for one may not work for another, unfortunately.
So we don't see any treatment for, say, down the road that would cover every individual under this umbrella. Okay.
No, I don't think that'll be possible just because of how variable it is.
Okay, that helps. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions or comments, then I'll go ahead and end this session, and I'll think about doing a part 2 at some point. Thank you.